Göbekli Tepe turned out to be what you think it might have been, the place where advanced ancient civilization once inhabited, or they used it.
Göbekli Tepe itself was the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. It was something that marked, it was a marker. It was something that brought together the best of everything that they'd accumulated and created it in one place.
This is what happened when a prehistoric site forced scientists to admit that early humans were far more advanced than anyone had ever allowed. Göbekli Tepe, a stone complex buried beneath a quiet hill in southeastern Turkey, did not just alter the timeline of civilization, it overturned it. What began as a routine excavation became a confrontation with everything modern history claimed to understand about intelligence, progress, and the origins of society. Discovery and timeline collapse. In the mid-1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived near the modern city of Şanlıurfa after reviewing survey notes that described scattered limestone fragments on farmland. What he uncovered was not a settlement, not a burial ground, and not a defensive structure. It was something no one expected to find so deep in the past. Beneath layers of soil lay massive stone enclosures arranged in near-perfect circles, each one anchored by towering T-shaped pillars carved from solid limestone. And that's when the dates came back. Carbon analysis placed the earliest structures at roughly 9,500 BCE, making Göbekli Tepe more than 11,000 years old, which meant it predated Stonehenge by over 6,000 years, came long before the Egyptian pyramids, and existed in a world where writing, pottery, metal tools, and farming had not yet appeared. None of that matched what archaeologists had been teaching for generations. According to the established model, civilization followed a specific order. Humans learned to grow crops, formed villages, developed social hierarchies, built religious centers, and only then began constructing monuments. Göbekli Tepe did not follow that sequence. The people who created it were hunter-gatherers. They carried no signs of permanent homes, left behind no agricultural tools, and showed no evidence of domesticated plants or animals. Yet they organized massive labor forces, quarried stone from bedrock, transported blocks weighing over 50 tons, and raised them into carefully planned formations. That contradiction changed everything. Each enclosure was built around two central pillars, standing taller than an adult giraffe, surrounded by a ring of smaller monoliths. The stone surfaces were not crude, they were polished. Their edges were clean. The carvings were deliberate. Relief images of animals covered the limestone, including lions, snakes, boars, foxes, birds, and scorpions, each etched with confident precision. But here's the thing. These were not decorative sketches. High-relief carving requires removing large amounts of stone around the figure, leaving the image raised from the surface. That process demands patience, skill, and planning. One wrong strike can destroy the entire design. Yet the builders repeated this process across dozens of pillars, each one distinct, each one intentional, which meant these were not people struggling for survival. They had time, structure, and purpose. And that's when researchers realized they were looking at something older than agriculture, and older than anything that had ever been labeled civilization. Göbekli Tepe was not a village. No hearths, no homes, no daily life debris. It functioned as something else entirely, a place built for meaning. None of that fit the story scholars had been telling for decades, and none of that could be ignored. The result was a growing tension inside archaeology itself. Either the dating was wrong or the timeline was. The dates held, which meant the story had to change. By the time Schmidt passed away in 2014, less than 5% of the site had been excavated. Most of Göbekli Tepe remained buried, sealed beneath layers of earth as if someone had hidden it on purpose. That detail would become important later. Because once scientists accepted how old the site truly was, a more disturbing realization followed. Builders and social organization. Archaeologists had long believed that early humans built only what survival demanded: temporary shelters, simple tools, and small camps that shifted with the seasons, because life without agriculture offered little stability and even less time for monumental ambition. That expectation collapsed the moment Göbekli Tepe was measured properly. The site covered more than 20 acres, containing at least 20 massive enclosures arranged with intention, each formed by towering limestone pillars that rose more than 18 feet into the air. Some of these monoliths weighed over 50 tons, a mass comparable to several full-sized buses stacked together, and none of them were naturally positioned on the hilltop. They had been carved directly from bedrock quarries below the summit and hauled upward without metal tools, without wheels, and without domesticated animals. That fact alone forced a re-evaluation of what these people were capable of, because modern engineers studying the terrain concluded that moving stones of that size uphill would still challenge industrial crews today. What made this even more unsettling was that the stones showed no evidence of trial and error failure. There were no half-finished pillars discarded nearby, no cracked monoliths abandoned along the slope, no chaotic scatter of broken attempts. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not appear to be learning as they went. They arrived with a plan, and that plan worked. But here's the thing. This kind of craftsmanship does not emerge from a society that is barely surviving. It requires stable food sources, coordinated labor, and a social structure that allows some people to specialize while others support them. None of that fit the hunter-gatherer model archaeologists had been using. And that's when the geometry of the site began to raise new questions. The pillars were not scattered randomly. Their spacing followed repeatable patterns, and their alignment suggested intentional planning rather than improvisation. Digital mapping revealed symmetry that could not be explained by coincidence, and once those measurements were visualized, it became clear that Göbekli Tepe had been engineered rather than assembled. What nobody expected was the absence of daily life. There were no houses, no storage pits, no hearths, no domestic refuse. People had not lived there. They had traveled there. That meant this place was never meant to be a village. It was a destination, built for something powerful enough to justify enormous labor without offering shelter or food in return. And that realization shifted everything, because Göbekli Tepe was no longer just old. It was intentional, it was purposeful, and it was evidence that complex social systems existed long before agriculture ever appeared. Symbols become data. For years, the figures carved into the limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe were treated as symbolic imagery, explained through ritual, mythology, or abstract belief systems because there was no written language to anchor their meaning and no known culture from that era to compare them to. Vultures, snakes, foxes, boars, and scorpions appeared again and again, arranged in ways that felt intentional but resisted every traditional interpretation. Some researchers saw spiritual allegories, others believed the animals represented clan symbols, and a few argued they depicted stories that had been lost to time. Yet none of these explanations accounted for why the same patterns repeated across different enclosures with such consistency. That stalemate held for decades, until a completely different way of looking at the site emerged, one that did not ask what the carvings meant emotionally or culturally, but what they represented structurally. That changed when high-resolution LiDAR scans and three-dimensional modeling recreated the entire complex digitally, capturing every groove, depth, and alignment with microscopic precision. Instead of examining the pillars individually, researchers began studying them as a system, and that's when machine learning tools were introduced to analyze the data without human bias. The software compared positions, orientations, and groupings, searching for relationships that the human eye often overlooks, because it instinctively looks for narrative first. What nobody expected was that the results would begin to mirror something familiar. The animals were not scattered arbitrarily. Their placements followed consistent spatial rules, and when those rules were compared against astronomical reconstructions of ancient skies, the correspondences became impossible to ignore. The scorpion aligned with the region of the sky associated with Scorpio, the fox mapped near Sirius, and other creatures matched star groups visible from that latitude roughly 12,800 years ago. These were not loose associations. The relative spacing, orientation, and clustering matched the heavens with unsettling accuracy, which meant the carvings were not symbolic in the way archaeologists had assumed. They were referential. And then came Pillar 43, often called the Vulture Stone, a single monolith that forced a deeper re-examination of everything. For decades, its imagery had been interpreted as a death ritual, a mythic scene or a spiritual allegory, because it showed a large bird-like figure looming over a headless human shape surrounded by other animals. But when computational models overlaid its layout onto reconstructed night skies, something else appeared. The arrangement matched a specific celestial configuration tied to a narrow window in time. That moment coincided with the onset of the younger Dryas, a sudden climatic reversal that brought intense cooling, flooding, and widespread ecological collapse. Geological evidence already showed that the planet experienced dramatic disruption during this period. What the carvings suggested was that the people of Göbekli Tepe had witnessed something catastrophic and chose to preserve it in stone. That realization transformed the site's identity completely. Göbekli Tepe was no longer just a place of ritual or gathering. It functioned as an archive, built by people who observed the sky carefully enough to track it, understood time deeply enough to mark it, and believed memory itself was worth preserving across generations. And once that became clear, a far more unsettling question emerged. If these stones were meant to remember something, what exactly were they trying to make sure the future would never forget? Engineering and lost methods. Once researchers began treating Göbekli Tepe as a deliberate system rather than an artistic curiosity, the physical construction itself became impossible to ignore. Measurements taken from the oldest enclosures revealed geometric relationships that could not be explained by chance. When the center points of 3 of the earliest chambers were digitally connected, they formed a perfect equilateral triangle, with each side matching the others to within a fraction of an inch. That level of precision requires long-distance measurement, controlled layout, and spatial planning, none of which should have existed more than 11,000 years ago. These builders were not estimating, they were calculating. That realization pushed scientists to examine the stone surfaces more closely. Using high-resolution laser scanners, teams mapped the tool marks etched into the limestone, expecting to find the irregular, jagged textures typical of stone-on-stone carving. Instead, they found long, narrow cuts that remained straight for several feet, with consistent depth and width. Traditional stone tools cannot create marks like that. They chip, they splinter, they wander. These did not. The surfaces looked controlled, almost softened, as if the limestone had been altered before shaping rather than chipped away through brute force, which meant the builders were using methods no one had anticipated. Chemical analysis of the nearby quarries added another layer to the mystery. Portions of the bedrock showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, with limestone altered at temperatures estimated between 750 and 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That kind of heat does not come from open flames. It requires sustained, concentrated energy. Even stranger, those same areas showed evidence of rapid cooling, a process known as thermal shock, which can fracture stone along predictable lines when applied correctly. Modern stonemasons understand this technique well, but it requires precise control, careful timing, and extensive experience. These people were using it at the end of the Ice Age. And here's the unsettling part. There was no visible learning curve. The earliest pillars were just as refined as the later ones. There were no rough prototypes, no experimental failures, no discarded attempts in the quarries. The builders did not appear to be inventing these techniques. They were already fluent in them. That created a problem archaeology could not easily solve. If this knowledge did not develop here, then it had to come from somewhere else. And once the site was abandoned, it vanished. Later populations in the same region did not continue the tradition. The geometry disappeared. The precision ended. The advanced stone shaping stopped. It was as if an entire body of technical understanding had been lost. But the most disturbing detail had nothing to do with how Göbekli Tepe was constructed. It had to do with how it was sealed. Rather than collapsing through neglect, the entire complex was deliberately buried. Thousands of tons of fill were brought in, including limestone fragments, animal remains, and broken tools, then packed tightly around the enclosures. This was not erosion. It was intentional preservation. Soil layers were arranged carefully, sealing the pillars from air, water, and time. And the data showed something else. The burial happened quickly, not over centuries, over a short span, which meant the builders were not closing a chapter. They were hiding it. Calendar and catastrophe. When computational modeling was applied to the carvings, led by Dr. Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh, who approached the pillar as an engineer rather than an archaeologist. Instead of asking what the symbols represented culturally, he treated them as units of data. Every V-shaped marking was mapped, measured, and counted. What emerged was not a story, but a structure. Exactly 365 V-shaped marks were carved into the pillar, arranged in repeating groupings that matched a full solar year. These were not decorative accents. They were days. The pattern revealed a sophisticated lunisolar calendar, one that tracked both the moon's phases and the sun's yearly cycle. The system divided the year into 12 lunar months of roughly 29.5 days, then added 11 extra days to realign with the solar year. That type of calendar would not officially appear again for thousands of years, yet it was carved into stone at the end of the last ice age, which meant the builders were not just watching the sky, they were calculating it. And that's when something even more unsettling appeared. When Sweatman's team reconstructed the ancient sky over southeastern Turkey using astronomical simulation software, that marker aligned with the position of the summer solstice around 10,850 BCE. This was not an approximation. The alignment was precise. The carvings corresponded to constellations visible during specific times of year, with animals representing star groups rather than mythic creatures. They were encoding information. Further analysis showed that the calendar was not just tracking seasons. It accounted for axial precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotation that changes star positions over thousands of years, a phenomenon not formally described until ancient Greece. The pillar also appeared to reference recurring meteor activity, particularly the Taurid meteor stream, whose fragments periodically intersect Earth's orbit. This was not casual observation. This was long-term astronomical tracking. And that raised an obvious problem. Why would a prehistoric society need a calendar this advanced? The answer emerged when researchers compared the encoded date on Pillar 43 to geological records. It aligned with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden global cooling, massive flooding, and widespread ecological collapse. This was not a slow climate shift. It was violent, abrupt, and devastating. They were preserving a moment when the sky changed their world. Burial network and warning. By the time researchers recognized Göbekli Tepe as a system of preserved knowledge rather than a ceremonial site, its most unsettling feature became impossible to ignore. The complex had not been abandoned. It had been sealed. This was not random collapse. It was intentional protection, and the speed at which the burial occurred suggested urgency rather than tradition. Something had changed, and whatever it was, these people believed their message mattered more than their presence. That realization forced a shift in how the entire site was understood. Cultures do not hide what they consider meaningless. They preserve what they believe must endure. Göbekli Tepe was not built for permanence through use. It was built for permanence through concealment, which meant the builders were thinking beyond their own lifetimes. They were not speaking to their neighbors. They were speaking forward in time. That became clearer as nearby discoveries began to accumulate. Across southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered a growing number of related sites built in the same style, using the same pillar forms, the same animal language, and the same spatial logic. One of the most striking was Karahan Tepe, where human figures carved directly from bedrock and matching animal motifs appeared again, reinforcing the idea that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a regional network, a system of locations that shared a common purpose rather than a shared mythology. The repetition mattered. These were not local traditions. They were coordinated expressions of the same idea, the same symbols, the same structure, the same visual grammar, which meant the builders were not inventing meaning at each site, they were repeating it. And that's when the role of modern technology became impossible to separate from the story. When artificial intelligence and computational modeling entered archaeology, these ancient sites stopped being treated only as artifacts. They became data. Patterns began to emerge that human observers had never been able to see, not because they were careless, but because the human brain is not designed to compare thousands of spatial relationships simultaneously. Machines are. The results were unsettling. What had once been described as symbolic became referential. What had been interpreted as ritual became instructional. What had been labeled primitive became deliberate. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not guessing at the sky. They were tracking it. They were not mythologizing catastrophe. They were recording it. They understood something modern civilization has only recently begun to accept. The universe is not stable. Disruption is not rare. Time does not move gently forward. It cycles, which meant this site was never meant to glorify survival. It was meant to preserve memory. The builders encoded their knowledge into stone because stone outlasts language, outlasts tradition, and outlasts collapse. They were not trying to tell a story. They were trying to prevent forgetting. And that brings everything back to the beginning. This is what happened when a prehistoric site forced scientists to admit that early humans were far more advanced than anyone had ever allowed. They were not waiting for civilization. They were already living inside it. And they hid their warning where time itself could not erase it.